My first experience with the 3D Castlevania games was the game known only as Castlevania for the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 and the game belonged to my brother, as I had chosen to go with the PlayStation. And I have to admit, like many people, I hated that game. I had just finished Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and I was excited for more of that Metroidvania-style gameplay. Everything about the Nintendo 64 Castlevania seemed wrong. The 3D graphics were garish, and I felt that even the original game on the NES looked better. On top of the bad graphics, the gameplay was terrible. It was hard to aim, the camera was trash, and it just wasn't fun. Every area was filled with fog due to the system's short draw distance, and the vast open rooms and outdoor areas felt empty. Several years later, I bought the first Castlevania game that arrived on the PlayStation 2, Castlevania Lament of Innocence. This was definitely a step up from Konami's first attempt at a 3D Castlevania on the Nintendo 64. I played this game for a little bit. I believe that I got through a few areas, but ended up never finishing the game. Too much was still not designed well enough to keep me interested in playing. It's one of the few games that I ever sold back to a store, and I never really regretted that decision. Recently, I decided to try the game again and give it a second chance. After all, there's a lot of people that do speak highly of the game. I think that my attitude towards Lament of Innocence at the time was a little biased due to the fact that I really enjoy 2D games, and it seemed like at the time, every company was forcing 3D gameplay on every one of my beloved franchises. Castlevania was just the final nail in the coffin on my anger that companies, not the players, decided that no one wanted 2D games anymore. This time around, I knew what to expect from the game, and I'm much more apathetic to the games from this era. We currently have many great 2D games right alongside 3D ones, and many of those companies that were forcing 3D down our throats, like Konami, well, how's that company doing these days as a successful video game developer? So how does this game stack up to other games in the Castlevania series? After playing through the entire game, I can say that it falls somewhere in the middle. It's above average, but this game has a lot of flaws. At the same time, it does a lot of things really well and deserves credit where credit is due. Let's start with the story itself. It's set at the earliest point in the series' timeline and replaces the origin story from Castlevania Legends on the Game Boy. You play as Leon Belmont, a knight of the Crusades who has left the Order to hunt a vampire that kidnapped his betrothed, Sarah. You travel to the vampire's castle named Castlevania and encounter an alchemist named Ronaldo whose daughter was taken by the vampire, Walter Bernhard, many years ago. He's crafted a whip known as the Vampire Killer, but wasn't powerful enough to use it, so he gives it to you in hopes that you'll succeed where he failed. Leon enters the castle and begins his quest to save Sarah. Though this plot seems almost identical to Rondo of Blood, substituting Leon for Richter, and Sarah filling the spot of Annette, this is a point in the series where it takes a much darker turn. At times, the story can be quite grim, and very few of the characters featured as allies in this game make it out unchanged, or in some cases, alive. The setting is dark and gloomy. The castle apparently hasn't gained its supernatural regenerative qualities yet and feels like an old rundown castle, much like the ruined castle described in Bram Stoker's novel. All the characters you meet have gone through their own battles unsuccessfully and come to rely on you as a means to redeem themselves. The thing I didn't necessarily like about the story, and I have this issue with pretty much every prequel game or movie, is that the story is not intended to be told first despite the chronological placement. Most of the twists and turns in the plot are designed around the idea that you already know how this story is going to end. By mid-game, you'll have a pretty good idea about who will eventually become Dracula, a character bizarrely absent from the game. The payoff of the plot is getting to that point where the reveal is made, but we already know how the story is going to end very early into the game. The other issue is that to tie this game into the already established continuity, there's a gigantic text scroll after the credit sequence to link the game. We don't see how the character transformation into Dracula happens, we're just told about it happening sometime between this game and Trevor's adventure in Dracula's Curse. This is really an unsatisfying way to end the game. Maybe they were planning on a sequel that would include this adventure between Leon and the character that will become Dracula, but that never materialized into anything. When it comes to the design of the castle, there are good and bad elements to this. You get a map, and it looks similar to the one from Symphony of the Night, but unlike that game, each level is a separate map. You can't travel from one area to another. Instead, the castle entrance works as a hub world, and you teleport to each area. There are 5 areas to start, and you can complete them in any order you choose. The House of Sacred Remains is a destroyed chapel. The Anti-Souls Mystery Lab is a laboratory and torture chamber. The Dark Palace of Waterfalls is the obligatory water stage that seems to be in every platforming game. The Garden Forgotten by Time is the garden filled with poisonous plants. And finally, there's the Ghostly Theater filled with skeletons and ghosts. Once you complete all these stages, you'll climb the floating staircase to the Pagoda of the Misty Moon. Graphically, each area is distinct from each other, which provides some variety, but several areas seem like generic castle corridors, just in different color bricks and wall decorations. The Mystery Lab, House of Sacred Remains, most of the Dark Palace, and half of the garden are stone castle hallways, and playing through these gets visually boring. The layout of each area is quite different in design from each other. Some areas, like the garden, are a large single-floor dungeon spanning a giant area, while others, like the Palace of Waterfalls, features many levels stacked on top of each other with floodgate controls that need to be opened or closed to access certain areas. Since you can access any of the first 5 areas in any order you choose, there isn't a difficulty progression in this game. A few of the areas are a little easier than others, but overall the difficulty is about the same across all levels. While you might need a key or item from one area to access secrets in another, getting to bosses and acquiring the orb for the level can always be obtained with equipment found in that level. Most of Castlevania's iconic areas are featured in the game, with the exception of one, and this really disappointed me, and that's the Clock Tower. It's completely absent in this game, and I'm not sure why. It appeared in the Nintendo 64 game, so it was definitely possible in 3D form, but it's just missing this time. Along with the missing clock tower are flying Medusa heads, though their absence doesn't bother me one bit. Enemies are your typical Castlevania-style enemies. You'll find lots of skeletons, zombies, mermen, suits of armor, flying demons, and flea men, among many others. Bosses include many classics like Medusa and the Rock Golem. They're joined by a succubus, a room-sized parasite, and a minor vampire. If you've tried the Nintendo 64 games, you know how bad the controls were, and while this game makes many improvements, they're still pretty rough. You control Leon with the left stick. You have the option to walk or run depending on how far you move the stick. He only moves in 8 directions though, so lining up for jumps can sometimes be pretty frustrating. There is no camera control either, despite the fact that the right control stick just duplicates the D-pad functions. As you move through a room, the camera will automatically rotate in a predetermined direction. Unfortunately, that means that you'll enter many rooms with the camera facing you and the wall behind you, while enemies are shooting projectiles and attacking you from behind the camera. It gets tiring to always be taking hits from off-screen due to the poor camera placement. Also, the way the camera rotates forces your character to move in the direction of the camera rotation even when you're trying to walk straight. This is especially bad on narrow corridors where you can fall off. When you attack, the game assists you with some auto-aim features. You can't turn this off, and while it's helpful, it can also be a hindrance sometimes. Sometimes you'll try to attack a particular enemy, but the auto-aim decides to swing at something else. With the Fleamen, the auto-aim is always a step too slow. The Fleamen will jump behind you and attack you before your attack completes. You have 2 attacks, a regular and strong attack, each having their own button, and there are combos you can perform. Like many games post God of War, you enter a combo, Leon will be unresponsive until the full animation of the combo is complete. There's no way to break the sequence once it's started. While the camera can be annoying, it's manageable and I got used to it after a while. The thing I never really enjoyed though is the platforming. There isn't a huge amount of it in this game, but what's there can be only described as frustrating. First, the depth perception is really bad in this game. It's really hard to gauge the distance between platforms and objects relative to each other. You'll have to jump with almost pixel precision, and it's nearly impossible to determine where your character is compared to platforms. It doesn't help that, like the original Castlevania, once you jump, you're committed to that full jump. You can't change midair. It gets worse when you have to whip a post to get a boost jump due to bad perspective, pixel-perfect positioning, and split-second accurate timing. Some jumps for progress are even blind jumps towards the screen, and some of these took dozens of attempts to get right. As I played through the game, I realized that the extended platforming sections, specifically in the ghostly theater, was the thing that made me quit this game so many years ago. It was that frustrating to me. Each level is pretty big and there are plenty of secrets to find. Every area has a locked door that requires a key from a different area, so to get 100%, you have to backtrack through a completed level at least one time. Other secrets are in the form of hidden switches, puzzles that open a door when completed, jumping to an obscure platform, or breaking a wall. Like Symphony of the Night, you have an inventory that can include items to restore your health, or status effects, and armor to help you survive. You don't gain levels like Symphony, but your health, magic, and heart meters can be increased with hidden items. Despite having an inventory, you can only have one sub-item at a time. You can pick up the dagger, cross, crystal, and axe. You find these by breaking candles, just like classic Castlevania. I'm disappointed that the Cross of Fear, sometimes referred to as the Boomerang, is not present in this game. Defeating bosses gives you an orb, and unlike all previous games, the orbs are actually useful in this one. Equipping an orb will grant you an enhanced attack with your sub-weapons. This was actually fun to try these out, finding the combinations that give you the best attack for your playstyle. There's also a shop run by Ronaldo, so you can stock up on items when you're running low. He also sells armor and relics that give you new abilities. These are unique to the ones that you find in secrets throughout the castle. I found out the hard way that if you sell something back to him that he already sold, it can be purchased again. But if you sell something that you find in the castle, it's gone forever. No warning or anything. Fighting the bosses was the most fun part of the game. Each boss has multiple forms or attack patterns, and they're all unique. Finding their weaknesses was fun, and some of them were quite challenging. There's also secret bosses that will give you a new whip as a reward. Each of these whips contain an elemental power, like fire or ice. The graphics in this game are pretty good for the PS2. The game normally runs in interlace mode, but if you have a mod for your system, you can force progressive scan. Unfortunately, if you force progressive scan, all the cutscenes won't play, which means you won't be able to see any of the story progression. Leon along with the enemies looks good, and they're all unique in design. The polygon count is high enough that they aren't blocky. Leon moves very naturally, but many enemies have limited animation, so they seem more like models more than anything else, bosses being the exception. The game also runs at a pretty good frame rate. I don't know if it's 30 or 60, it looks like 30, but it doesn't dip very much and there's almost no slowdown. There's a good use of color, especially with the red on Leon's white clothing, but the game is very dark. I had to turn the brightness to maximum on my TV just to see some of the areas. Depending on what you're playing the game on, this may or may not be possible. Sound effects are also good, with many sounds used in previous games making a return. This really helps to make the game feel like an authentic Castlevania experience, despite the gameplay style changes. The use of echoes makes wide open areas seem very spacious, and you can tell how far enemies are away from you by the volume of their sound effects. The voices are adequate, but the line readings from the voice actors are pretty stiff and sometimes lack any emotional impact, especially the voice actors for Ronaldo and Sarah. Where the game impressed me the most was the soundtrack. Returning is Michiru Yamane, who has been composing the Castlevania soundtracks since Bloodlines on the Genesis. Every one of the tracks is excellent with lots of intensity and that mix of gothic and metal that the series is known for. The only thing I really disliked is that you have to beat the game at least once in order to access the sound test to listen to the music tracks. This should be a standard feature in all games. Here's a sample of some of the great music featured throughout Lament of Innocence. Once you've completed the game, you're given instructions on how to start the game with a different character by entering specific names at the start. You do need the save file of your completion to make these names work. Beating the game with these new characters allows you to enter even more secret names for different gameplay. There's even harder difficulties that you can unlock. Overall, I mostly enjoyed my time I spent with this game this time around, but not enough to play through every level again with a different character. Sure, his method of attack is unique and different, but there are far too many frustrating aspects of the gameplay, like the camera and platforming, that I just don't want to do again. For fans of Castlevania, I'd recommend trying it out and see if you like it. The level design is interesting, and it further expands the lore of the series. For those that are just looking for a good 3D platforming game from the early 2000s, I'd probably skip this one for a more refined game. I'd love to hear your thoughts about Lament of Innocence in the comments if you played it before, or any other thoughts that you might have about the Castlevania series. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then.